Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. Going over chapter 13.1. So hopefully you can follow along. We're kind of going over the first set of politics in Oklahoma during this time. We talked a little bit about Oklahoma becoming a state. They had to do some provisional stuff before that to kind of set up the Constitution and set up some of their first set of laws, but it wasn't officially like laws until they could like come together and meet. So we're going to talk about that. So we talked about Oklahoma becoming a state in 1907. We see that in November of 1907, we see that Oklahoma's first legislation actually really started to convene in December of 1907. We see Henry S. Johnston was the Senate President pro tempore, and William Murray was named Speaker of the House. So we see that these individuals come together, they form finally the House and the Senate of the state, and then they start to talk about their legislative laws. So here you are. Here's a number one right here in blue. But the progressive movement influenced a lot of the laws of that time. We had first actions of legislature, child labor, worker safety, public health and sanitation, convict labor, and other labor issues. Um, we also see provisions were made for county and local governments establishing towns, cities, elections, teacher training, textbooks, school attendance, and more. But and again, if you hear some like background noise, that's my kids watching Narnia. But anyway, um, they're watching a movie. They earned it. Anyway, so number one is right there for you guys. So that basically we start to see the legislation kind of setting up the state and kind of expecting certain things. One of the other things that also need to be established was taxes. I mean, because here's the thing about a state and any country, you got to have revenue. If you're going to have any public, um, funding or any sort of way to make money, you got to have revenue. The only way to do that is through taxes. So the income tax and the property tax are established. So income based off how much money you make. Property tax is based on pretty much, um, if you own any property. Also authorized taxes on businesses and industry. There's the inheritance tax, so better known as the death tax, placed on mostly property. But you would see, like, if anybody had any money left over, for example, like if my parents, and this is what goes on today. I mean, this precedent is still here today, but um, there are certain taxes involved um, when it comes to leaving money. So if I leave money for my kids, that money for them will be taxed based on how much I do leave behind. But it kind of depends. But Governor Haskell and the legislature knew that the strong banks were necessary for a strong economy. Also, the public's trust in banking system was vital at this time. So we see a charter for banks and a certain percentage of its daily balance to fund that was used to ensure deposits in the event of a bank failure. We also see higher education officially becomes state schools. I mean, so we talked about some of these territorial schools established, but they're no longer Oklahoma is no longer a territory. It's now a state. So you have to rename it. It's now a state, not a territory. So by 1892, you had the Oklahoma Territorial and University in Norman. University of Oklahoma is what it's renamed. And then Oklahoma Territorial Normal School in Edmond, renamed University of Central Oklahoma. And then the Oklahoma Territorial um, uh, Agricultural and Mechanical School in Stillwater. It's going to be renamed Oklahoma A&M, but then eventually it will become Oklahoma State. We're all holding classes in 1892, but eventually their names are going to change once we become a state. Then the private colleges, before 1907, there are other colleges in Alva, Langston, Weatherford, Kingfisher, Tonkawa. But excuse me, private colleges. We see Epworth becomes Oklahoma City University, and then Henry Kendall College becomes Tulsa University. Then by 1909, established 3 normal schools to train teachers and additional schools as well. As far as legal discrimination, this was happening throughout our state, not just our state, but throughout our country. There were other individuals that or other individuals who are discriminated during the time of the South. Um, and we see that a lot of it was mostly happening everywhere in that South. Not saying that they weren't discriminated in the North, but like on the books, legal discrimination was basically in the South. So Plessy versus Ferguson kind of set that standard of that you can separate as long as everything was equal. So you could separate races as long as everything was equal. So one of the first issues in our state legislature was Senate Bill number 1, which segregated African Americans on railway cars. And it was also waiting rooms, and then eventually racially biased law passed by both parties. Actually, I'm going to change this one. You want to also put waiting rooms as well. So it's waiting rooms and railway cars. Oklahoma began the debate and passed laws that made segregation legal. Many protests began. One of those was in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City actually prohibited blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. And this is actually quite true. It did happen at one point in time. We see William Floyd challenge the law. He had purchased a home in a white neighborhood. He was going to move in, but he was arrested for trying to move in. Eventually won his court ruling in his favor. But we see that blacks were better off in Oklahoma than in the South, other parts of the South. Compared to Texas, more black children in Oklahoma attended school, fewer were illiterate, and the average value of black-owned farm doubled than that of Texas. By 1910, though, blacks were 8% of the population, and we see a lot more black towns existed at this time. We do see that political parties played a big deal. In 1907, Democrats controlled the government. The Socialist Party also made a big part in our state government, had support when it came to unionists, miners, immigrants, and intellectuals. Many blamed the poverty on the wealthy and saw the Socialist Party as an answer to that. And we see this early in the 1900s, the Socialist Party, not just in Oklahoma, but elsewhere. But Oklahoma had the most members, more members than any other state in the United States. But voters supported breakup of large landholdings, government support for farmers, cooperatives, organizations owned by and operated for those using their services. Woo. Doing some yawning. We see political parties. Republicans gained some power. Democrats blamed on black voters who favored the Republicans. So we see that this is starting to become an issue. We see A.C. Hamel, a Republican, was the first black representative in 1910. New laws were created to limit blacks' voting power. Grandfather clause said that the person could not vote unless they had a descendant from the person who could vote in 1866 or could pass a written test. Problem with this is that, one, there was not a living African American who voted in 1866. Just didn't happen. Or at least the certain date that they had scheduled. The other issue, so you then had to come up with a written test. Well, here's the problem with the written test. It was in a different language, so that made it very difficult. We see in 1907, Kate Bernard became the first woman elected state office, Commissioner of Charities and Corrections. She wanted to kind of push back on some certain state prisons and really kind of figure out more efficient, safe prisons or care for those of the mentally ill. And we see that she goes into Kansas, where they suffered in where she goes. She comes back from Kansas, where they had suffered poor conditions, and she comes to Oklahoma trying to set up a better prison. So McAlester becomes the first state penitentiary or prison. We see Bernard worked on additional laws for protection of children, orphans, and the mentally ill. Moving a capital, we see Guthrie made capital by Enabling Act of 1906. But Democrats did not like the Republican influence there. Governor Haskell called for a special election on June 11th, 1910. Voters chose Oklahoma City as a capital over Guthrie and Shawnee. We'll talk more about this, but basically Haskell, he did not want Guthrie to hold on to the and hold on to the capital until 1913. So he moved the seal himself, we see that Governor Haskell, once it was established that Oklahoma City was going to be the next capital, he secretly moved offices into a hotel, and then they had someone bring the official seal from the Capitol there to set up their home offices. And the governor also worked to keep rates low from railroads. Here you see number 13. All number 13 for Lee Cruz is right here. Lenore Moore Banker was elected Oklahoma's second governor in 1910, started plans for a state capitol building, completed in 1907. The dome actually was not completed until 2002. World War I played a part of that because they were rationing a lot of supplies, and steel was one of those that they were rationing. He angered the legislature by trying to cut the budget. The democratically controlled legislature wanted to withdraw. The districts weakened the Republican vote. This is called gerrymandering. Excuse me. Hoo-ha. Gerrymandering. When Cruz threatened to veto the legislature's plan, the matter was deferred until 1913, and he did start the Department of Highways. Robert L. Williams, your answer number 14. He's the first governor to move into the state capital. This is what he accomplished. He tried to reduce state spending, expanded state highway system, created workers' compensation state, limited women's workday to 9 hours, and funds for veterans, widows, and orphans. He also did try to suppress the black vote. One way he did that was basing the exemption on military service rather than literacy, but Oklahomans voted against that proposal, probably because they obviously didn't want blacks to vote. He kind of was trying to at least help African Americans vote, but again, voted against. So, but that does it. We'll have 13.2. I think we're done with our unit, and you guys could take a test. Woo! All right, that's going to do it for class today. Catch you on section 2.